All right, I'm just going to go ahead and get started. I think the talking is the best way to get everybody back in the room. So I want to say thanks again to the ambassadors Saru Khan and Hills for coming today. They're doing some interviews right now with us. But I also want to say a huge thank you to the rest of our panel who's here, a very distinguished panel, and all people who have taught me how to think about these issues. We have first, Ralph Watkins, to my left, who's a senior international trade analyst in the Advanced Technology and Machinery Division at the U.S. International Trade Commission. He's an expert on manufacturing between the United States and Mexico, has written extensively on that issue, including a recent paper, The China Challenge to Manufacturing in Mexico, which I relied on heavily in my report to understand the competitiveness of Chinese exports versus Mexican exports, production in China versus Mexico. He's really an expert on that issue, and thanks so much for coming today. Also have at the far end Roberto Newell, who's vice chairman at the Instituto Mexicano para la Competitividad, that's IMCO, which is an independent think tank in Mexico. It's established to develop policies and enhance Mexico's competitiveness. He was previously a scholar with us here at the Wilson Center. He was also Deputy Secretary for Agriculture in Mexico, worked at McKinsey for many years, advising corporations and national governments to focus on financial and telecommunications. He writes a column for Reforma, has a PhD in economics from the University of Texas at Austin. Thanks so much for coming, Roberto. And lastly, my previous professor and boss, actually, at the American University, Bob Pastor. Dr. Pastor is a professor of international relations. He's the founder and director of the Center for North American Studies at American University. In a previous life, he was the director for Latin American and Caribbean Affairs on the National Security Council under President Carter. He was vice chair of the Council on Foreign Relations Task Force on the Future of North America. He's a visiting professor at Harvard University, where he had previously received his PhD, and most recently is the author of a wonderful book that it looks like he has with him. He'll be able to show you, The North American Idea. So thank you also for being here very much. I can't thank you enough, and some of the other members of the audience, for your support in writing this report also, which I'm going to briefly present. Much of it's been covered already by the two ambassadors' remarks, so I'll try to move through it quickly. And then we'll have, I think, an excellent panel discussion of the work and, really more importantly, about competitiveness in the region. So this publication, Working Together, Economic Ties Between the United States, the competitiveness and therefore the economy of the United States in particular, but also of the region as a whole, the United States, Mexico, and even Canada. I don't know that I need to do this at this point, but before I quickly get into the arguments, I just want to say that Mexico is really important to the United States economy. Trade between the two countries in 2011 was over $400 billion. That's well over $1 billion a day. Mexico is the third largest trading partner of the United States and second largest export market. 6 million American jobs depend on trade with Mexico. That means 1 in 24 American workers depend on U.S.-Mexico trade to sustain their job. Mexico's the second, at times it's the third, it goes back and forth between Saudi Arabia and Mexico, but the second most important source of oil for the United States. It's in sum, Mexico's clearly important partner of the United States economically. The first argument showing how ties between the United States and Mexico support the region has to do with Mexico's growth. Similar to many emerging markets, Mexico is growing faster than the United States. Grew 5.4% in 2010, 3.9% in 2011, and is expected to grow between 3 and 4% for the next several years. All of those rates faster than the United States growth. Mexico has a large and growing middle class also. Its middle class doesn't have the same income or financial security as the middle class here in the United States, but nonetheless there's been a huge transformation over the past couple of decades in Mexico. It's been a transformation meaning more access to schooling, healthcare, the ability to buy consumer goods, things like having a washing machine in your home, the capacity to take a family vacation, and maybe most importantly, the capacity to invest in one's children and their lives. That's largely due to a larger number of women in the workforce in Mexico and smaller family size, meaning that the parents, more incomes in a family, can support in a greater way and invest in the future of their children. That growing middle class also means that there's a growing market for U.S. goods. Mexicans tend to have consumer preferences that are similar to people in the United States. That means that U.S. companies are at a competitive advantage when serving the Mexican market, which is growing, both because of the growth of the entire country and in particular the growth of the middle class. Since Mexico is growing, that means that U.S. exports to Mexico are growing. And since U.S. exports are tied with Mexico's growth, that means the United States has a clear interest in promoting Mexico's growth, and it should do so actively. What also makes U.S.-Mexico trade special, beyond its volume, and this is really the core argument of the report, is production sharing. And Ambassador Hills presented some of these statistics and some of this argument. But production sharing or outsourcing, it's known as also offshoring or vertical integration. It's basically the splitting of production into the production process into discrete activities that take place across several countries. That could mean that you mine ore in one country, transform it into steel in another, create parts in several different countries. Maybe those parts are shipped back to one of the original countries where a final product is made. It's this process of creating a good, final good, across several countries. In the case of the United States and Mexico, trade tends to bring goods across the border several times as they're being produced. This growth in intermediate goods, which are parts or inputs, it's a global trend, and it's been one of the drivers of globalization over the past couple of decades. Firms have become increasingly willing to be mobile, to move across countries, to find the best setup for their production, to find the best and cheapest way to make goods to serve whatever market they are serving. It has several implications. It means that a label that you read on a product, whether it says made in Mexico, made in the USA, made in China, means less now than that label used to mean. As goods are produced across countries, they're rarely made in one single country. So the iPad, for example, there's been recent studies showing that where the profits of iPads and iPods end up, and the reality is that despite their label that says they're assembled, made in China, the value added happens across several countries, more so in the United States than China, for example. That means that regular trade statistics tell us now less than they used to. So how valuable is it to know how many, $1 billion, X billion dollars worth of iPads are exported from China if only a couple $1 million of that value added is happening in China? We have to look a little bit deeper into the trade statistics to understand what's in our interest as a country and as a region as we move forward in this new world. U.S. imports from North America contain many times more content, U.S. content, than from anywhere else in the world. It means imports from Canada, and especially Mexico, support U.S. jobs and industry in a way unlike any other major country. 40% of the content in Mexico's imports to the United States was actually made here in the U.S. That's 40% of the parts in those products, you can think of it that way, were made in the U.S., or you can think of it as 40 cents for every dollar that we spend on Mexican exports stays right here in the United States supporting local jobs and industry. 25% is the number, 25 cents for every dollar from Canada, and just 4% from China. So you see that there's a very different type of trade that's happening inside of North America than between North America and our neighbors throughout the rest of the world. This means that when the choice is between offshoring production to China or Asia or nearshoring it, keeping it in Mexico or Canada, the choice of which is in our interest is very clear. Through production sharing, I'm going to go to this in just a second, actually. Through production sharing, the United States and Mexico each focus on the portion of production that they do best. They can combine the comparative advantages of each country, which makes the entire regional industry more competitive. The United States has a long history of these types of production sharing arrangements with Mexico. There was a Maquiladora program started in 1965. And also, despite trends toward offshoring, there are several factors that incentivize keeping production nearby, near to your market and near to the home of your business. Those are things like communication, mostly transportation, but also it's important what capacity the workers have to produce in a certain country to produce the goods that you need. This production sharing system, these linked industries in the United States and Mexico, mean that our economies as a whole are linked not just in a high volume way, a lot of trade, but in a profound way, in a very deep way. The integration of the manufacturing sector means that the United States and Mexico tend to grow together and experience recession together. It means that we'll sink or swim together to a large extent. And that means that we need to work together in order to strengthen the economies of both countries as a region. The auto industry is a perfect example of production sharing. North America leads the world in the trade of intermediate goods in the sector, and it's actually the foundation of North America in a larger way. The EU, the European Union, for example, began as the coal and steel community with a few countries in Europe. North America began with the United States and Canada Auto Products Agreement in 1965. Later, we have the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement, and then NAFTA brought Mexico into this North American economic region. And because of this, the auto industry is growing in both Mexico and the United States. It's no coincidence that following the downturn in 2009, the auto industry has recovered very strongly. It's in part due to the integrated supply chain and market throughout North America. And because of the strength of this industry, Detroit, rather than any border city or town, is actually the city that exports the most products to Mexico. I want to talk briefly about foreign investment. Bilateral foreign investment is often the foundation for these production sharing arrangements. As both countries invest in one another, they deepen the bonds between the two. It's been growing in both directions. Foreign direct investment, this is stocks in foreign direct investment rather than flows, which happen on a yearly basis, so this is cumulative over time, is now at 6 times its pre-NAFTA levels. Mexican investment in the U.S. is still small, but it's growing, and it's largely an untold story, so I think it's worth looking at. In 2008, majority Mexican-held companies employed 46,200 people in the United States and operated 124 production plants. The other direction, U.S. companies, which are often transnational companies, often have huge investments in Mexico. Those investments and that presence in Mexico, as opposed to other countries, is also good for the United States because it keeps the production in the region based on, you think of the 40% that stays in the U.S. when products are imported from Mexico. U.S. investment in Mexico supports Mexico's development and the development of its middle class, also strengthening the United States. Just quickly, some examples of foreign investment from Mexico in the United States, since it's such an untold story. Cemex, for example, is the largest cement company in the entirety of the Americas, has huge investments in the United States. Bimbo Breads is the largest baked goods company in the United States. It runs 34 bakeries in 13 states and has 15,000 employees. And actually, that figure is a little bit dated because in the past year, last year in November, Bimbo finished its purchase of Sara Lee and all of its brands, so greatly expanding its production and employment that it sustains in the United States. América Móvil is the largest cell phone company in Latin America, also has brands in the United States, like TracFone, for example. And its owner, Carlos Slim, is also part owner of the New York Times and Saks Fifth Avenue, although not the majority owner in those cases. So given the extent of regional economic integration, the economies and to an extent even the destinies of the United States and Mexico are tied together. The question then is how to make the region more competitive. Trade is generally a positive sum activity for all the parties involved, but there are some aspects, some pieces of it that we should think of in a little bit more of a zero-sum perspective. The competitiveness of industries, for example, is relative. In manufacturing, what we find, what counts is finding ways to have better products and ultimately better prices. Having the best prices is about being ahead of somebody else, of being more competitive. And right now, the most serious challenge to a region's competitiveness is China and other countries in South and East Asia. Since China joined the WTO in 2001, its exports to both the United States and Mexico have skyrocketed. It passed Japan, Mexico, and then Canada to become the top supplier of U.S. imports. As China's competitiveness increased, many U.S. and Mexican firms also moved their manufacturing from the region to China, mainly in search of cheap wages. But as outsourcing became more and more popular, companies that were doing it also began to realize that it's not just about finding the cheapest wages. There are several other factors that contribute to where the highest productivity can be found, where the best place to locate production is. So it's helpful to compare the comparative advantages of each region. China is generally better, very high volume, continuous flow production, things that require very low skill assembly work that happens in high volumes. This could be things like toys, basic electronics, many times textiles. Labor is cheaper, and the government's often willing to incentivize companies to move to China. They offer things, subsidized energy costs, sometimes land. So there are strong incentives to move there, but Mexico also has significant advantages. It can effectively compete with China in products that I would classify in 4 different categories. First would be products that are very expensive to transport. It's a much bigger distance to get goods from China to the United States, and if they're hard to transport, the advantage goes to Mexico. Those could be things like motor vehicles, home appliances, things like washers, dishwashers, washing machines, refrigerators. They could also be things like large electronics, big screen TVs, for example. A second category would be things like precision instruments or medical supplies, goods that require, that are quality intensive, that require skilled labor and significant quality control. That tends to be done better in Mexico than in China. Third group are manufactured goods that serve as inputs for U.S. producers that are using production sharing. So auto parts, for example, it's such an integrated industry. It doesn't make sense to make parts in China where it would take a long time to get them to the United States if you're going to pass them back and forth between the countries several times as you're producing a final good. It makes more sense to stay within the region so that you can use things like lean manufacturing, just-in-time supply chain management that really depend on a quick transport between the 2 countries. The last one are custom designed products, or products that are shipped in small batches to the U.S. companies and consumers. You wouldn't want to have to load those products into a giant boat and offload them in Long Beach and then separate them out into several small shipments when you could just put them in several trucks in Mexico and send them to their respective destinations. Mexico generally has an advantage of manufacturing small to medium volume runs of products, the early phases of product development, and custom work. Things where it's important for the market to be very near, or where it's important that the designers of the products are near to the place where the production is happening. This means that Mexico's advantages are based on proximity, and that advantages based on proximity aren't going to change. Geography doesn't change over time, whereas things like energy costs, electricity costs, currency values, those things all do. So since proximity is an advantage, border management between the United States and Mexico is just key. In terms of regional relations, the obvious place to start improving competitiveness is at the border, since almost 80% of U.S.-Mexico trade crosses the southwest border, most of that by truck. National borders are generally a barrier to trade, a point of friction as trade flows move across the 2 countries. For example, it takes more work to get goods across the U.S.-Mexico border than the Pennsylvania-Ohio border or any other state border in the United States. That difference, that extra work that it takes to get goods across the international boundary is the border effect. It's the amount of friction that's happening for that trade. When you're involved in production sharing, that works as a multiplier on the border effect because it means you're passing goods across the border several times, having to pay whatever costs those are multiple times through a production. Given that we have NAFTA in North America, those payments, those costs, aren't usually tariff costs. They're non-tariff barriers. They're things like customs work, border wait times, all these things that need to be done that still make it more difficult to use the international border than a state border. Unfortunately, over the last decade, efficiency at the border has often been sacrificed in an effort to improve security. And border security is obviously very important, and to be clear, I'm not proposing sacrificing security in order to facilitate trade, but I think that we can do both at the same time. 2 major events have transformed the nature of the southwest border over the past 2 decades, and I would propose that perhaps a third one is underway. NAFTA in the 90s cut tariffs and made trade skyrocket. Here we go. After that happened, we had 9/11. The terrorist attacks of 9/11 brought the threat of foreign non-state actors to the front and center of consciousness of Americans, led to an increase in border security. Unfortunately, that increase in border security, trying to keep out illicit trade, also had the side effect of keep slowing down the legal trade that we do want to allow to happen. This graph shows that these measures caused a serious decline, especially in private vehicle traffic, which is linked to retail sales on the border as Mexicans cross in the United States to buy goods. But it also caused a stalling out, in part caused a stalling out of the number of trucks entering the United States, which had been growing significantly in the previous decade. More attention in this context of an increased border security, more attention was given to the areas between the ports of entry, a huge increase in the Border Patrol, for example, and less attention was given to the infrastructure and staffing needs of the ports of entry. Today, trucks full of many hundreds of $millions worth of goods line up to cross the border every day. These long and unpredictable wait times act as a tax on these products that are crossing the goods, making them less competitive and more expensive, and as that's happening, incentivizing the move to China, for example, where you would only have to cross a border one time, even though it's much further away. I'd argue that we could be on the cusp of a new phase, although it may need some leadership to be taken advantage of. The event that would be driving that is the economic crisis of the last few years, which has made clear to the public, I think, in the United States, that the country needs to be more competitive in order to succeed in this changing world. Some of this will, increasing of competitiveness will hopefully be done internally in each country with reforms, investments, education, technology, things like that. But there's no doubt that it needs to also be done regionally. President Obama started the National Exports Initiative a few years ago, which had the goal of doubling exports by 2015. I have no doubt that this can only happen if the United States takes into consideration its two largest export markets, Canada and Mexico, and finds ways to facilitate trade between these countries. The economic crisis is an opportunity to bring commerce back to the national conversation about the border. President Bush's Smart Borders plans started to do this and look at these issues. And President Obama and President Calderon's commitment to create a 21st century border went further in this direction, but there's nonetheless much more that remains to be done. Security's dominated the debate, and competitiveness of the region has been lost as a result. On the border, some of the things that we could do would be an increased investment in border infrastructure to improve competitiveness. We could look at customs pre-clearance, clearing goods for passage across the border away from the border so that we don't have to depend on border infrastructure so much. We could do clear goods in Monterrey or in other parts of the countries. Perhaps we could look at the increased use of trusted travelers programs. On the southern border, we have Symmetry and FAST, which allow travelers that we know present a low risk to move faster with their goods or as individuals across the border. And finally, an increased focus on fully staffing the ports of entry is also key. I was going to talk a little bit about regulation and customs, but I think that's actually something we've talked about a lot today already. They're obviously facilitating the harmonization of regulation, and simplifying customs procedures is obviously one of the key ways that we can improve competitiveness in the region. I'll just quickly also mention a few more examples of things we could do as a region to improve our competitiveness. We could have more educational exchange between the two countries, which would create greater understanding, greater opportunities for commerce. We could jointly, both countries have an issue connecting education systems to the labor markets, and we could work jointly on solving these problems. We could have strengthened mechanisms for investment in the border region. It could be perhaps an expanded mandate for the NAD Bank. We also need more investment in continental transportation infrastructure, but beyond just investment in transportation infrastructure, we need coordination while we produce it. We can't let an investment on one side of the border just facilitate the flow of goods and trucks to lead to a bottleneck on the other side of the border. So we need our transportation ministries in both countries, and all three countries in North America, to be coordinating so that we have one regional integrated transportation network. We could have greater coordination and cooperation on issues of trade compliance, WTO compliance. That could mean things like China's currency issue or anti-dumping issues with several countries. We'd have a stronger position working together on those issues than singly. And lastly, it could mean negotiating new trade agreements as a region. There's a possibility that TPP could be, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, could be this type of an opportunity, but we're not sure if Mexico and Canada are involved yet and what position the three countries would take together on it. Nonetheless, these issues that are focused on the border in many ways and how you produce enhanced regional competitiveness are not just border issues. The volume of trade at border states are clearly the largest beneficiaries of the trade relationship. Texas, for example, alone sells 44% of all U.S. exports to Mexico. But Midwest states with strong manufacturing sectors also sell huge volumes of products to Mexico. There are 20 states in total that export more than $1 billion worth of goods to Mexico. Let me get the next one up. As a percentage of total exports that go to Mexico, the border states are also very high, selling between about 15 and up to 35% of their exports to Mexico. But another set of states also ships huge portion of their products to Mexico. South Dakota, for example, ships an extremely high percentage, mostly in processed foods, to Mexico. New Hampshire, it's also the #1 market for their products is Mexico, selling electronics in particular. Nebraska with crops, Iowa with crops and processed foods. Mexico is the top export market for 5 states: California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and New Hampshire. But it's also the second largest market for another 17 states that are across the whole nation. So in today's competitive global market, the United States and Mexico stand stronger in partnership with one another than in competition. But nonetheless, there are plenty of political obstacles that get in the way of implementing the policies needed to take advantage of the relationship. I think that's where these types of statistics come in very useful. Many politicians and private sector leaders, especially those from the border states, understand what's happening with the United States and Mexico, understand the importance of trade between the two countries. But there are too many policymakers and leaders that have no idea how important Mexico is to the United States. That's why this type of data is so valuable. It makes it abundantly clear that U.S.-Mexico issues, that border issues, are not just border issues. Border issues have reverberations throughout the country, and if we can help present information that makes clear the importance of Mexico as a market for people in Nebraska and Ohio and Michigan, as well as states like Texas and Arizona and New Mexico, it makes the next step of getting policies to move forward that will enhance competitiveness quite a bit easier. Communities across the country have so much to gain from taking a proactive approach to regional competitiveness, but it can only be done when the case is made as to why Mexico matters to the United States. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll get out of the way now so that people who are my teachers and the real experts here can talk about this stuff. Thanks. So I think first on the agenda we have Roberto Newell. Would like to go?
I can't take credit for Chris's education. I'd be glad to do so, but I can't. So what I'll do instead is try and get the ball rolling, and I hope to create a polemic, because if I create a polemic, then perhaps we will create the conditions that lead to more light. At the bottom of, and as the foundation of his paper, and by the way, of the two the speeches that we heard before, is an implicit view of the world that says the U.S. is really critically important to the world. Mexico is appended to the United States in a relationship that it cannot change. It should be in everybody's interest to have Mexico and the United States come closer together, because doing so is inherently good for Mexico and probably enhances the U.S.'s competitiveness as well. I threw in that probably enhances the U.S.'s competitiveness as well as an oh, by the way. Now let me create the polemic. There is a school of thought very present today in the United States, which is debating whether the United States has entered a long-term secular decline. The type of work that I'm referring to is exemplified in some very scholarly approaches taken by people like Niall Ferguson, the British historian at Harvard, who's questioning, and I don't think he's predicting, I think he's questioning whether the United States has begun to move in the same direction as other great powers historically have moved in to by overstretching its resources, its capabilities, by trying to fulfill a role in the global economy, and particularly in the security of the global political structures, that tax it beyond its means to pay. And I want to insist that I'm not for a second arguing that Ferguson's concluded that the United States is in long-term secular decline. I think he's asking a very thought-provoking question. And now imagine that the answer is, geez, the U.S. is in long-term secular decline. Would Mexico want to be tied to something that is sinking? And I think the answer is pretty self-evident. We're way too young a nation, way too poor a nation, to tie ourselves to something that isn't convinced that it wants to be healthy. And so I would then ask the question, and I think this is an important question for Mexicanists and Mexicans to ask and answer. Are we willing to bet our future on the well-being of the United States? I think if the United States is going to do well, the answer should be pretty self-evident. But if the United States is not, then perhaps it's not. And this is where the polemic starts. And I would ask a second set of questions. Is there a set of policies that Mexico's government or state, Estado, to make it clear that I'm speaking as if I were a French scholar, should undertake that would pay off no matter what happens to the United States, whether it goes very well into the future or whether it does very poorly in the future? And I think that there is a very clear agenda that Mexico should be working on that works regardless of what happens to the United States. And I'd like to throw those forward because I think that that suggests that Mexico should be looking for an approach about its own future that works no matter what happens to the gringos. And if it happens to that the U.S. is in good shape, so much the better. And here's the things that I think we should really be worried about if we care about the future of Mexico. And I see so many Mexican faces here that I think that you should all feel the way I do, that I want to know what that list looks like. Number one, I think we need to invest significantly in human capital. No matter what happens to the U.S., having a better trained population is going to pay off. There's also no regrets associated with carrying out energy sector reform. We know very well that both Pemex and CFE, the two titans of the Mexican energy sector, are very underproductive, very undercompetitive, could improve dramatically in their performance. And no matter what happens to the United States, the reform of Pemex and CFE would be good for Mexico. If it turns out that the United States does really well, having a more competitive energy sector would be so much the better, because we would be in better shape to take advantage of that health of the United States. It's also very clear that no matter what happens to the United States, Mexico would do very well to carry out a set of reforms to strengthen its economic institutions, those that guard the quality and efficiency of our markets. I'm thinking of things such as the Comisión Federal de Competencia, COFETEL, the CRE, and other institutions of this sort whose role is to be guardians of the performance and efficiency of our markets and to ensure that key regulated sectors are doing the job well. If it turns out the United States is doing well, so much the better, because we will have stronger economic institutions that develop stronger economic entities to take advantage of this improved environment. But if not, it'll be better for Mexico anyway. It's also very clear that we would probably do better if we were more successful in our fight against organized crime. And so those sets of reforms that are required in order to improve the quality of our enforcement of the law and improve our ability to fight crime within institutional constraints and with respect for the rule of law would undoubtedly strengthen Mexico's performance regardless of whether the United States is doing well or not. It's also true that if we had stronger local governments, I'm particularly worried about the quality of our municipal governments, Mexico would do better, regardless of whether the gringos are doing well or not. Finally, it's also very clear that if we do something to enhance our international reputation, to restore the credibility of Mexico in the eyes of the rest of the world, we would gain, whether the U.S. is doing well or not. And so we might be actually coming to a conclusion which is startlingly important, and that is it doesn't matter one whit whether the U.S. is in long-term decline or not. It does not matter one whit whether the United States resolves its issue, whether it wants to be a dowager living off of the assets that it collected over its history, or whether it wants to act like a youthful nation full of energy. We are next door to the United States. That is a compelling piece of truth. But if we want to be in control of the well-being of our nation, it does not matter one whit whether the U.S. is doing well or not. What matters is how we're doing governing our own nation. The 7 reforms that I pointed to are worth about 3 points of increased growth in the productivity of labor in Mexico. Roughly half of our population today participates in the labor market. Productivity in Mexico has been stagnant for the last 15 years. Stagnant is actually an overstatement. It's been growing only at about 1% per annum. Other nations, which are growing much more rapidly, say the BRICS, are showing 2 and 3 and 4% rates of increase of labor productivity. And so what we have to do is really focus our energies on doing those things that unleash the tiger that's called Mexico and make it more successful in the global economy, whether the U.S. is doing well or not. What's the difference whether we do these things or not? Well, if we were able to have our labor productivity grow at 3% per annum, the per capita incomes of Mexicans would double in less than 20 years. Mexico would then have become a nation of relatively well-to-do global citizens. Our per capita income would be about 50% higher than the average per capita income of the citizens of the rest of the world. We would be on an income level that's comparable with today's Korea, which is certainly better than what we have today. And so now it doesn't really matter terribly much whether we live next door to a society that's declining or whether it's a society that is full of energy. The debate should not be whether we solve border crossing issues, though there's nothing wrong with solving border crossing issues, whether we put together a stronger customs union with the United States or integrate more thoroughly with the United States, because in the final analysis, that is to throw our future into the hands of others. I think Mexico should be very selfishly looking to its own well-being. And that requires that we attend an agenda of changes that have been long postponed and which are the ones that are holding us back. It's not whether the U.S. does well and, as a consequence, whether we are in good shape or not. It's whether we Mexicans take control of our own lives and do those things that are indispensable to make our nations modern, powerful, and as successful and competent in the global economy as anybody would want it to be. Thank you. Did I get the polemic going?
I think you succeeded in that. Dr. Pastor, would you like to go ahead?
Can I?
Yeah, if you'd like to use the podium, please.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your patience in hearing all of these presentations. I think it's a special gift on Valentine's Day when a student can present a report as comprehensive and as insightful as Chris Wilson did. And I'm very pleased not only to have read it, but to hear his delivery of it. So I think that was a very nice gift that I was not expecting today. I think he is suggesting a couple of ways that we need to change the way we look at Mexico and the way Americans need to change the way they look at themselves within the continent. Even though he focuses on Mexico, there is no question that there is another neighbor to the north that finds itself in very similar position to Mexico. Indeed, just listening to Roberto talk about how Mexico needs to focus on its own priorities first and foremost and cannot depend on the United States is a replica of a series of responses to my op-ed that I wrote in the Globe and Mail a couple of days ago. The Canadians came back afterwards with very strong arguments. Let's forget about the United States. We can't depend on the United States. The language and the rhetoric is no different. And the impact is no different as well. But Chris's first and most important paradigm shift is one that you all know, which is that Mexico matters. I would say North America matters to the United States, but that the United States really doesn't pay a lot of attention to it because the pervasive thread that has characterized U.S. relations with our neighbors is asymmetry. Mexico and Canada are much more dependent on the U.S. market than the U.S. is on them. And what the U.S. needs to understand is that even though that is very imbalanced, we are still more dependent on our two neighbors than we are on anybody else. And indeed, we have reached the point of interdependence where the United States needs to incorporate that into their thinking and their economic policy, but we're not doing that. And I would say, actually, we need Mexico to help us to see that. And even more, we need Canada to understand that Mexico is a collaborator and that the road to Washington for Ottawa should go through Mexico City because it's only then that the United States will pay attention. It will not pay attention as long as the Canadians adopt the strategy of divide and be conquered. You know, there's a great puzzle. The truth is that the great countries in the world have always adopted a strategy of divide and conquer. The puzzle is that Canada has developed a strategy of letting itself be divided from its natural ally, Mexico, so that it can be conquered by the United States. And it needs to change. So the first paradigm shift that he's suggesting is Mexico matters, as he points out. Second one is that the nature of trade has changed fundamentally with our two neighbors. We are producing goods together. That is not widely understood in the United States. It's widely understood perhaps in this crowd and some others, but it's not widely understood that we are producing goods together. If it were widely understood, President Obama's State of the Union address would have looked very different. Throughout that State of the Union address, he talked about changing our tax system to encourage investment only in the United States, to encourage making it only in the United States, to encourage Buy American approach. And that's quite debilitating. The truth is, when he turned to Steve Ratner to reorganize the auto industry, and I went to see Steve, and I said, well, are you going to go down to Mexico and up to Ottawa to talk about doing this on a coordinated basis? Ratner said, no, the president said, your main mission is to protect jobs in the United States. I said, well, that's maybe true, but you can't do that if you don't understand that the cars that are being produced in the United States are actually North American cars. But we did it. We did do that in a completely uncoordinated fashion, and that's true overall. So the first paradigm, Mexico matters. The second paradigm is that we are in a different stage of joint production, which means that those who measure the effect on jobs by looking at the balance of trade each year have got the wrong criteria. Sid Weintraub once made this point a long time ago. When you're jointly producing goods, the criteria that matters is overall volume of trade and value of trade, not the balance of surplus and deficit. But again, that's not understood very widely. I think there are several other paradigm shifts that are needed. The next one I would say is to understand we are in a world of competing regions. The European Union is the most integrated. East Asia is moving very rapidly towards freer trade areas. North America is the least inspired. North America, we're still resting on our laurels of the North American Free Trade Agreement. But Will Rogers once said, even if you're on the right road, if you sit down, you're going to get run over. And that, of course, is what happened with North America. We were run over by China. We need to understand that we need to move forward on a different agenda. Carla Hills is absolutely right. You don't want to reopen NAFTA. NAFTA is complete. You do want to address a new North American agenda that reflects this new joint production paradigm. Because joint production now means that we are halfway in between dealing with intranational domestic issues together and halfway in between dealing with international issues. That blurry line that we've often talked about between domestic and foreign policy is now a defining characteristic of North America, but we have not yet adapted our mechanisms of governance to address these issues. We are not thinking about competitiveness on a continental basis. Roberto's response about what Mexico should do is correct. I mean, you're absolutely right. Mexico has to focus on its priorities. But if we really want to lift the entire continent to a new level of competition with East Asia, we need to think continentally. We need to think about labor mobility on a continental basis. We need to think about transportation on a continental basis. So that is a critical ingredient. Right now, we are not making decisions together at all. We pretend to meet from time to time, and we measure our success by the number of meetings, but not by results, because there's good reason. There are very few results. If you look at trucking, Ambassador Sado Khan was, very adept, as he always is, in not answering my question about how many trucks are actually going across the border. 75,000 trucks every day reach the border, and about a dozen cross the border. I don't consider that a great success. If our goal is the creation of a seamless market, then, as Chris pointed out, we ought to aim so that we could trade between Dallas and Monterrey at the same cost or even less than between Dallas and Chicago. But there's no comparison right now because we are not thinking continentally at all. If you look, as I asked Carla Hills, at rules of origin since we started in 2005, there's been no progress dealing product by product. If you look at even the negotiations between the U.S. and Canada on pre-clearance facilities between Ontario and Buffalo, no progress at all. If you look at this latest iteration of the Smart Border Agreement that came out on December 8th between the U.S. and Canada and December 15th between the U.S. and Mexico, and then you look back at a 1996 agreement on the border, and then the Smart Borders Agreement of 2001 and 2002, and subsequent agreements, they aren't different. They are the same. They are simply continuing to declare goals which we think are the right goals. I personally think they're the right goals, and there's a good declaration of the nature of the problem. But there's been almost no progress on any of these issues. And so that should force us to ask a series of questions, which I hope will be Chris's next book, which is, why are we failing so miserably? I would argue that we're failing miserably because we don't understand the nature of the problem, and our default option is to be pragmatic and incremental. That is to say, let's just address one issue at a time. Let's stop with these big ideas of a customs union. Let's put aside a North American community, and let's just get to work on how do we make the border more efficient. How do we make our regulatory differences converge? I think the relevant point of departure is ask ourselves why we have made no progress in these areas. On regulatory divergence, President Bush and President Fox and Jean Chrétien all met. They set up this National Competitiveness Council. They started on 2 regulations that they wanted to harmonize. They wanted to harmonize regulation on Cheerios, which of course was Carlos Gutierrez's major obsession, and Stephen Harper's obsession was on jelly beans. I went back to the leaders of the 3 groups in our 3 countries that are working on regulatory convergence, and I asked Cass Sunstein, for example, and Simon Kennedy and others, have you looked to see why there is no single regulation on jelly beans and Cheerios, despite the highest priority by the leaders of the Secretary of Commerce and the other, and despite the fact that they've been working on it for 6 years? And of course, the answer was no. They hadn't looked at it, and they still haven't looked at it. You go back and ask them again, why? Well, I think the answer is clear to me. It has to do with the nature of special interest and bureaucratic interest, autonomous commissions, and the fact that we do not have a mechanism in the United States that gives greater weight to the continental interest of the United States vis-a-vis these special interests. So these special interests are always going to stop us. They're always going to lead to no results. And therefore, I was led to conclude that actually you do need to start with a big idea. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to start with a big plan. You can break off pieces of the plan, but you cannot make any progress unless and until the United States, first and foremost, and then Mexico and Canada have an idea of their interrelationship and what the continental promise can bring them. You know, Ronald Reagan, who I don't often quote, but since we're in a building housed by Woodrow Wilson and Ronald Reagan, that's enough to boggle my mind. He did say once a prescient comment about North America. He said, the United States will be better off if our two neighbors grow faster than us and do better than us. And it's time for us to stop looking at our two neighbors as foreigners. We need to look at them as neighbors with a common enterprise. That is where we need to go to. I congratulate Chris for this excellent report, particularly in helping us to understand the implications of joint production for policy on trade, on investment, on competitiveness. And I invite him and his colleagues to take it to the next level and ask ourselves, by looking at specific cases, why we are going in circle, why North American relations look like Groundhog Day. At every conference I go to, the same groundhog keeps coming up, and the same questions bubble up, which is, oh, Bob, these ideas are totally impractical. The public opinion is against this. We can't move, and therefore, let's stop talking about it. No, my argument is that's when we should start talking about it. That's when we should start thinking big, and it's your generation that needs to do that. Thank you.
I want to thank Chris for shedding light on the North American Partnership. It's been a topic I've had an interest in since 1972, when I first took a bus from Eugene, Oregon, down to Tijuana and Mexicali to study the border industrialization program, back before it was called the Maquiladora program. And I want to thank Bob Pastor for being here. I ran into Bob at a workshop at SAIS several years ago, and he invited me to be a guest lecturer at his North American Center, and that's where Chris and I got to meet. And I also was able to hire a number of students from that program. So, and they were both very productive in the United States International Trade Commission, writing reports about production sharing, a topic that Chris went into great detail on. So thank you for supporting my previous research. I don't want to repeat what Chris has said. I want to just supplement what he has said. And if we look at one of the pieces of data from Chris's report, he mentions that 89% of Mexico's exports of manufactured goods that incorporate foreign components goes to the United States. Let's put this in context. 80% of Mexico's manufactured exports go to the United States, and almost all of those manufactured goods are produced by companies that are registered, that used to be registered under the Maquiladora and pt2 programs, and now it's called IMEX. So the globalization of manufacturing is key to the competitiveness of Mexican manufacturing. And I repeat that 80% of Mexico's exports are accounted for by manufactured goods going to the United States. Some of the manufactured goods that don't go to the United States go to Brazil, auto parts, and motor vehicles. So many so that now Dilma Rousseff wants to end the agreement, the free trade agreement between Mexico and Brazil in the automotive sector. So Mexico is competitive. Over the last, between 2000 and 2006, you'll see in Chris's report that the U.S. content or the U.S. share of the imported components that go into Mexico's exports of manufactured goods declined from 81% to 51% in just 5 years, between 2001 and 2000 and 2006, 6 years. That's a pretty significant decline. What's the cause of this decline? Part of the reason for that decline in the U.S. share is the free trade agreements that Mexico has negotiated with Japan and the EU. You're getting more and more Asian and European companies investing in manufacturing in Mexico, and they're sourcing a lot of their components in Europe and in Asia. It isn't that there's a decline in U.S. exports of components to Mexico, but rather an increase in foreign exports of components to Mexico, as Mexico is somewhat less reliant on the U.S. for investment in components, but they are reliant on the U.S. market as a place to sell those goods. Many of these assembly plants that were invested in by the Asians and Europeans, particularly Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Germany, are now producing auto parts, motor vehicles, computer and telecommunications equipment, flat screen televisions, and major household appliances. How serious is the China challenge? We've heard China mentioned a few times here. And between 2000 and 2005, imports from China increased by 143%. They more than doubled. They went up by 1.5 times in just those 5 years. Since then, however, in the last 6 years, between 2006 and 2011, imports from China increased only 39%. So during 2000 to 2005, imports from Mexico went up by 25%. In the last 6 years, imports from Mexico went up by 34%. So almost as fast as imports from China has increased. So if you look at it, so sort of a trend line about the rate of increase. Mexico, the U.S. imports from China increased by 143% in the first 6-year period, 2000 to 2005, but only 39% in the last 6 years. Mexico, however, went from 25% to 34%. So it's a very good sign for Mexican competitiveness. How about market shares? If for some of you who have the handout that you might have picked up, you'll see that the China's market share increased to increased to 18%. Actually, from 16% in 2006 to 18% in 2011. That's just a 2.6% increase in market share. Mexico's market share increased from 10.7% to 12%, a 1.3% increase. But the key thing is that over this period, Mexico has been able to maintain its share of the U.S. import market. So Mexico can compete with China. And if we if we look at, well, what's happening to U.S. manufacturing? We've heard some sentiment that the U.S. has kind of lost its way. If you look at the value of U.S. manufacturers' shipments, let's see, the manufacturer shipments grew by 11% during 2000 to 2005, and by 8% during 2006 to 2011. So U.S. manufacturer shipments are doing very well. What's happened, we have had a decrease in employment in manufacturing because of increases in productivity. And so we really should be reluctant about blaming imports for a loss of manufacturing jobs. Yes, imports from China are a concern. Are they competing fairly? That's a topic for another place. But if you, to keep things in perspective, let's consider the ratio of total U.S. imports from China to the value of U.S. manufactured shipments in 2011. That's 7.4%. So if we were to make China compete on a level playing field, and if they increased the value of their currency, it would be beneficial. Yes, let's all work for that, but it would have a very small effect on their on the value of U.S. manufactured shipments. We would increase our manufactured shipments a little, maybe, but that's it wouldn't be a panacea. Chris has already talked about the key factors that lead to Mexico's competitive position in the U.S. market. I won't repeat them. He did an excellent job. Let's look at some of the products where Mexico is very competitive in the U.S. market. Mexico, let's see, about 1/4 of Mexico's exports to the United States are in motor vehicles and parts. 6% in flat screen televisions, 6% in computer equipment, 4% in telecom equipment. Combined, these four categories account for 40% of Mexico's exports to the United States. But when consumers think about, or when you go to the consumer electronics store or other places to buy goods, you see a lot of made in China. You don't see a lot of made in Mexico. Part of that is because the things that Mexico exports to the United States don't have a label on them. You don't see the cars that are sent to the United States don't have a Mexican nameplate. They have a U.S. or Japanese or Korean nameplate. The auto parts, you don't see them. They're incorporated into the vehicle. For the telecom equipment, we might be buying cell phones from China, but we're buying telecom switching gear from Mexico, and so you're not going to see that label. For the motors. For scientific instrument measuring, for even let's take air conditioning equipment. The major type of air conditioning equipment we buy from China is ceiling fans and electric fans. And so you're going to open up a box and you're going to see made in China. For Mexico, it's going to be heat pumps. And it's the guy who installs the heat pumps that knows that made in Mexico. It's not going to be the person who actually has the house where you're using a heat pump. You don't know where it comes from. So I just want to reassure you that Mexico is competitive in the U.S. market, and that Mexico's competitive position helps U.S. manufacturers of components. It's good for U.S. jobs. Thank you.
So we have a few minutes to do a little bit of question and answer. So see in the back, Sadie Esbriseño, can we bring him a microphone to ask a question?
Thank you very much. I have two quick questions. The first one is for Roberto. It's what are the prospects for reform, in an election year in Mexico and the coming government? And for Bob, what is your main concern regarding TPP?
I mean, it's a tough question. I think that the prospects for reform in Mexico in a plural society are similar today to what they were in the last 10 years and are likely to be similar in the future. It really is much more about the will to want to act in coalition, to have the parties work together, than their ability to do so. There's been actually a prolonged and I think very rich debate about two different views of Mexico's political reform requirements. There are some who argue that Mexico needs to enrich its political structures and processes by allowing more direct participation of the electorate in political decision-making, having plebiscites and direct recourse to the nomination of candidates, for instance, are two issues that are talked about a lot. The re-election of municipal authorities would be another way of enhancing the presence of the electorate in decision-making. But there's also a school of thought that says, no, all that we need to do is play a little bit with the formula for gobernabilidad in the Constitution, and that would make it likelier that decisions can be made within the long tradition of Mexico's presidentialist model. I don't think that either of these is necessarily a bad idea nor necessarily the solution. It's the will to govern in coalition, I think, that we have to demonstrate. The moment that issue is resolved, this will to govern and to take these issues on, there's no reason we can't go like this. So I would argue that the mother of all reforms is that willingness to put together a coalition government. There is a good reason to think that Peña Nieto might be able to win the elections with a substantial majority in at least the lower legislature, perhaps in the upper legislature as well, in which case there's absolutely no reason why the PRI government could not, of its own, go forward in an agenda for modernization. I don't think the issue is can we do it within the rules of the game as we have them, but rather will we do it, and is the will to move there. And God knows the arguments are clear. That list of reforms that I was talking about has been around as long as I've been a baby, since the time I was a baby. So these are not new issues, and I think they're very well understood issues. What is necessary now is to move out of this political capture that we've been hurt by and get on to the next wave of reforms.
Thank you for the question on the TPP. I wanted to mention Ambassador Sarokhan said that we can multitask. I can walk and chew gum at the same time. And he can. But the U.S. government cannot. When the United States government decided to pursue its strategy of competitive liberalization during the Bush administration, of having small free trade agreements with a number of countries, it found that it took 8 years to complete an agreement with Panama and with Colombia. 8 years to complete what is in fact a simple agreement. And the reason is that from a political standpoint, to get a simple trade agreement is as difficult as to get a serious one. You almost have to put as much leverage behind a simple one and as much political capital as you do against something that's quite serious. So from my standpoint, that is to say from the standpoint of U.S. national interest and continental interest, if you will, as well, I think, first of all, this government has not done a systematic analysis that have asked whether a TPP or the deepening of North American integration will contribute more to the economic growth. In my judgment, it's not even close. The 8 countries that make the TPP have a combined GDP of 1/7 that of Canada and Mexico. These are 4 of the 8 countries. Singapore, Australia, Peru, and Chile already have free trade agreements. They're very open economies. The other 4, Brunei, which has a population of about 300,000, New Zealand, Malaysia, and Vietnam, these are very small economies. Those who think that pursuing the TPP are a way to open up the East Asian market are completely wrong, or even a way to get the Chinese to buy into it are completely wrong, because there are elements in the TPP, for example, on state-owned enterprises and government procurement that the Chinese see as directly aimed at them, and they have no interest in doing that. They have an interest in undermining it. And in fact, 1 week after the TPP was heralded in Hawaii, the Chinese met with the South Koreans and the Japanese and together decided on a 3-country free trade agreement with ASEAN. So they already preempted and trumped the TPP. Now, the TPP theoretically calls for the elimination of all tariff barriers and all exemptions, including in agriculture. Well, you know, I met with the Japanese delegation who passed through Washington soon after Hawaii, and they were here to lobby the special trade representative against negotiating with Japan, because they don't want to open up their market at all. So they're doing what Americans always do, right? They lobby other governments against their own government. So we can't really complain so much about it. There is no way that we're going to make that kind of progress on agriculture. The whole TPP exercise is a diversion from what should be the fundamental interests of the U.S., Canada, and Mexico to deepen economic integration, to move towards a common external tariff, to move towards a seamless market. That, in and of itself, would have a far greater impact on China than pursuing this will-of-the-wisp TPP. If you have an opportunity to hear Mike Froman, who's the Deputy National Security Advisor, who's the principal person responsible for different summit meetings, and who is a certain bias in favor of Asia and against Latin America and Mexico, ask him that question. Ask him, did you do a systematic analysis as to whether the TPP or a deepening of North American integration was more likely to enhance the American and the Mexican and Canadian economies? I think I know the answer to the question, but it'd be nice to hear from him.
Can I write on Bob's question to answer a question that hasn't been posed, but what I'd like to offer a response to? I liked something that Bob said a lot, and that is that we lack a vision for North America. In fact, that's the name of his book. And that if we had one, we might be going places more rapidly. And I agree with that. But I can also assure you that when the opportunity has come up for that vision thing to be discussed, it's been shot down like this. I was the Mexican secretary for the North American Competitiveness Council. Each of the countries had a competitiveness council, and each of the countries nominated a secretary to serve the function of doing the analytical lifting. And so I did this for Mexico, together with the institution that I was running. And I very early on said, you know, how should we discuss this? If we were talking about the port infrastructure of North America, in order to enhance the competitiveness of North America, we would then put aside our parochial points of view and ask the question, what is the lowest cost port and what are the highest rates of return available to a joint logistics solution? And it might be that it's not investing more in Los Angeles, Long Beach, or in Vancouver. It might be that we want to build something brand new somewhere on the west coast of Mexico. And you know what? I got killed like this. In fact, Secretary Gutierrez said, don't go that way. If you go that way, we're going to get into a tremendous political imbroglio. Let's look for the low-hanging fruit. Let the low-hanging fruit bias political capital that we can then spend on bigger and bigger questions long term. It was a very, very pragmatic view of how to approach problem solving. That was the mandate that the North American Competitiveness Council eventually ended up working on. And as a consequence, big issues to do with, for instance, regulation of entire sectors were shot down before they were even born. There isn't a North American vision. And it's precisely because there isn't even a vision about what the United States should look like, let alone North America, that I feel that we cannot afford to gamble our future on a society that doesn't know which way it wants to go. which is what trying to integrate too richly with the U.S. might end up costing us. There's a real big deal here. If the biggest country in the world, the most important democracy ever put together, doesn't know what it wants to be when it grows up, the world's in trouble. And it concerns the hell out of me as a Mexican, tied hip and thigh to the Americans, that you guys don't know where you're going. Because I know that I have lived in a society that most of its life has not known where it's going either. And the cost to us has been amazing. And I don't want to have my grandchildren be paying this cost into the future because we made the wrong strategic bets. Nobody wanted to hear that, but goddammit, you got to hear it.
Can we get a microphone over here, Margaret De La Hayes, and then we'll take the other question here also. This will probably be the last round of questions, so we'll take these couple.
First of all, I'm Margaret De La Hayes. I want to congratulate you, Chris, for a superb publication, and especially one of the few that focuses on the benefits that the U.S. gets from its relationship with Mexico, as opposed to how much we're taking in from Mexico, et cetera. My question, however, goes to this: who's going to define this vision? I'm not persuaded that the country is going to respond to the academic approach, even though I'm an academic, so they ought to. And I have been absolutely astounded at how the U.S. business community, which is very much engaged in benefiting from the shared production with Mexico, has been quiet on this since maybe the beginning, since the success of NAFTA. What is, other than pure and simple politics, what is keeping the business community from taking a lead, or the 2 or 3 business communities from being more outspoken on this issue? And then, Ralph, maybe a small question to you. Would we be better off talking about percent of content in products that come into the United States, as opposed to the last guy who touched them and put them in a box?
Let's take the other question also, and then we can all answer.
Hello, my name is Luis. I'm from Mexico, and right now I'm an intern to the Organization of American States, so the Summit Secretariat. And my question is open to the panel. How Mexico is seen by other Latin American countries? How a deeper economic integration with the U.S. and Canada will affect our relations with our economic blocs? And finally, is economic diversification an interest topic for Mexico, or it should be?
Thank you. Let's grab one more. This is from Karen Antevi, who I also owe a debt to for helping with the report. So.
Chris, thanks for putting together this great group and book. Question open to the panel. So we've got politics, you've got special interests. You pointed out, Chris, in your presentation to 2 groundbreaking events that changed the relationship, one being NAFTA, the other being the terrorist attacks of 2001. What is it going to take? Because I think that, Roberto, there is a vision, and there are projects that I think we all want to work, like the unnamed
port.
port.
Two of us have a vision. I don't think there is a vision.
What does it take?
Thanks. Anybody want to start?
Yeah, I got this one going. I might as well, live with it. Actually, you got it going more than I did. At least you've published to it. I think it takes leadership, and political leadership is the essential type of leadership. It's the private sector has a free rider problem, big time. Once the ball gets rolling, their interest is to pass it on to somebody else and have them keep it alive, because the shareholders aren't paying CEOs to participate in political debates. And in fact, some shareholders feel very squeamish about having their business leaders get very involved in this type of topic, and so there is a cost to business leaders who become distracted by political issues. It's okay to do so if you've gone on to the capricious phase of your political life or economic life, as I have, but not before then. And having sat on several boards, I know that we shouldn't be looking for the business community to provide the leadership. It ain't going to happen. It ain't going to happen because of this free rider temptation and because of the fact that shareholders, particularly of publicly quoted corporations, won't have it. They feel it's a distraction from the job of earning a buck. As a consequence, we're really beholden to political leaders because I agree, unfortunately, most academics don't have the type of charisma that's required to get Bob does, to get the ball rolling and get the debate as heated up as it has to be for us to get to that crucial moment where we make decisions. It might require another big crisis, Karen, to engender the conditions that allow the right discussion to be held. In fact, my argument would be that perhaps the American crisis has finally gotten the right debate going in the United States. I mean, as odious as the debate is to those who are sitting on the side, it's a debate about the future of this country and what it wants to be when it grows up. And that's the right discussion. I'm not sure it's the right discussion civilly carried out or intellectually robust, but it is the right debate. And crises tend to focus our concentration on the right questions, and hopefully this will lead to the right outcome. When that time happens, hopefully Mexico will have also answered a set of questions that it has avoided answering for a number of years and will have grown up and become the nation that it can be and is ready to take its place at the global arena. Together as partners, we could be formidable. But the fact of it is, neither of these two countries have got their, can I be colloquial? Their stuff together. Everybody thought I was going to say something else. See, and until we have our stuff together, we are not going to be stronger together than we are alone.
Yeah. First, Margaret's question about a vision and disparaging it by referring to it as academic, which unfortunately is a word of disparagement. But in my judgment, vision is very practical, that you either have to start with a big picture of what you want to do and look and define your goals in very broad senses, or you just go in circles. And I think it's precisely because we have not had that broader vision, a vision which I obviously spell out in some detail in my book, about the way in which we ought to relate to our neighbors and they ought to relate to us, and the way our governance process should be adapted to take into account the emergence of a continental space. That until you have that vision, I think we're going to be going in circles or nowhere. Why has business not acted? I mean, I think business has some of the disease that politicians have. They think small. I've gone to CEOs and said, you know, I've looked at your company and at your sector, and I think that about 15% of the cost there could be eliminated by collaboration among the three countries in North America on everything, on transportation, on a wide range of things. 15%. So what it takes is for you to identify that specifically, aggregate it across sectors and among the business community, and take the lead. And they don't. Even when the North American Competitiveness Council was brought together, each of those CEOs was focused solely on what are the tax implications for my company. You know, how can I use the FaceTime with the President of the United States to get him to buy into my earmark or my tax things? There's nobody, or my border crossing. They're not thinking big. Nobody is. And even our leadership is, you know, have we heard the two words North America in any of the presidential debates? We barely heard Mexico. I don't think I've heard Canada at all. Nothing. So the debate hasn't even come around to this yet. I think there is a critical question which may bring it around, I hope, although it would require some agility, which is emerging now about inequality. I think that issue is starting to emerge, and you've got not only Sheldon Adelson, who is a poster child for our campaign finance system in the United States, which is the most corrupt in the world by far, where people can buy their congressmen, senators, and even buy a piece of their next president, which Mexico doesn't have. Mexico leaped from the most corrupt electoral system in the Americas to one of the very best in just 12 years, while we've moved backwards at that same time. I think the inequality issue may offer an opportunity, because I think that's the other side of the trade issue, which has not been given adequate attention. Trade benefits all nations, but it doesn't benefit them equally. It has distributional consequences. Those factors, notably capital and management, are much more mobile. They can take greater advantage of trade. Those factors that are much more stationary, such as labor, can't. And over time, when you're talking about the technological component and the dividends that are coming back to companies, rather than manufacturing products going out, in a very large sense, international trade has exacerbated inequalities in the United States and within Mexico as well. So we need to come up with ways to compensate for that. If the only way we're going to have the momentum to keep going forward towards freer trade system in the world is you've got to distribute the gains of trade to those who pay the costs of additional competition. And none of the countries are doing that right now. So that may come up, I wish it were to come up, in the debate on inequalities and on corporate salaries. I mean, our CEOs are more interested in their golden parachutes than in thinking 10 years down the road of what their corporations should be. And that should be debated as well.
I just want to answer Margaret's question about how do we define who is us and where does this stuff come from? So when we see imports from Mexico, when I see them, or from Canada, or from Central America, I've been to factories throughout the Americas, and when I see the product, I can visualize where the components come from. I ask the engineers, where do they source the components? But if you don't have the luxury of having been to these factories, for all you know, the whole thing was made in that foreign country, and we know that's just not the case. But how do we make people aware of what let's say the U.S. content of a vehicle from Mexico, or a disk drive from Mexico, or a refrigerator from Mexico? How do we make people aware of that? Well, it's very difficult to get companies to respond to questionnaires that aren't mandatory, because they're so busy trying to make a buck, they don't want to have to fill out questionnaires. However, we do have someone at the International Trade Commission who's looking at that issue right now. His name is Justino de la Cruz. Justino, can you stand up, please? Justino is the International Trade Commission's Mexico expert, and he is embarking on a study of looking at North American supply chain to look at the how much value is added in each country and what states those products come from. So hopefully within the next year or two, we'll be seeing a very fine report that maybe he can deliver here at the Wilson Center.
Thanks. Actually, it seems that I owe lots of debts as I put together this report, but Justino is another person that helped me understand the way the process, the production sharing numbers, and how you need to look deeper into the numbers of trade in order to understand what's happening with production in North America. Just want to say quickly, I, in addition to work on economic relations here at the Wilson Center, I do work on the border. And in my travels to the border, that's where I've really found leadership, sort of at least latent leadership on these issues. I think that there are a lot of private sector leaders and politicians in that region who understand the importance of the U.S.-Mexico relationship. And I think it's really their job, as well as maybe my job, to help other people, leaders and politicians from the rest of the United States, understand the importance of this relationship, because it's going to take broadening the group of people that can see this in order to develop a constituency and leadership to move the issue forward. Let's see. I wanted to say that to your question, that I think that, Mexico, I think, has the opportunity to both diversify its trade while working with North America. I think, maybe we're talking about walking and chewing gum again, but I think Mexico's already demonstrated the will and desire to have a relationship, an economic relationship and trade relationship with the United States that works better than it does right now. It's also, at the same time, is expanding. I mean, the numbers of where Mexico is getting the inputs for this production sharing operations is diversifying. Now, the opposite, maybe we need to do a little bit more, which is taking advantage of Mexico as an export platform for North American products. So, in the United States, we need to understand what Mexico maybe already does in the way that integration with the global economy can go hand in hand with building a regional production platform. I had one last thing, which is just for Karen. I really do think that this economic crisis, this has changed. It's brought forth a series of questions for the United States. Sort of, where are we going? What are we doing? How do we stay competitive? And it's bringing those issues to the fore. They're being addressed very slowly. We have complicated politics surrounding them, but I still see it as it's an ongoing issue. There's the financial crisis of 2009 isn't over. In a lot of ways, it's still happening right now. It's still happening in Europe. It's still happening in the United States, and we're still asking ourselves questions of how do we become competitive again. And that's the time when we can offer answers that, not all of it. The United States needs to make internal reforms, but as does Mexico, as Roberto mentions. But we also need to work together on these issues, and now is an opportunity to bring those issues to the forefront. Thanks to all of you for coming today. Thanks again to the panelists for excellent presentations, comments, and have a good day, everyone. Thanks a lot.